I moved into the apartment on Friday. It was small, but perfect for me. An integrated living room and kitchen, a modest bedroom, and a balcony overlooking the quiet street. Nothing special, but the price was good, and the location, excellent. The owner, a middle-aged man with a polite smile, mentioned only one peculiar thing during the key handover. The last tenant left in a hurry, but I believe you won't have any problems here. I found it strange, but I didn't ask any further questions. The move was smooth, and on the first day I had everything organized. That night, I felt exhaustion pulling me to bed early. There was no sound except for the occasional distant noise of a passing car. A comforting silence, I thought. On the second night, while unpacking boxes, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was a low, almost imperceptible sound coming from the hallway of the building. Something between a whisper and a muffled murmur, as if someone were trying to speak without being heard. When I pressed my ear against the door to listen better, the sound immediately ceased. I opened the door and looked into the empty, dimly lit hallway. Nothing. Maybe it was a neighbor's television, but the silence seemed too heavy for that explanation. I closed the door, and, although I tried to ignore it, I felt uncomfortable. On Tuesday, something new happened. When I returned from work, I found the apartment door slightly ajar. My heart raced. I was sure I had locked it. I entered slowly, with my cell phone in hand, ready to call the police. Nothing was out of place. I searched every corner, even the bedroom closet. Everything was intact. I concluded it was paranoia and redoubled my efforts with the lock. But it was that night when the situation escalated. I was in the living room, watching television, when I heard a clear and distinct sound. 3 soft knocks on the wall behind me. I froze. There was no one in the apartment next door, I knew, because the neighbors told me it had been empty since last month. The sound came again, louder this time, as if someone wanted me to know they were there. I took a deep breath, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and faced the wall. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice firmer than I felt. No response, just the dull sound of something scratching slowly. Then, silence. I stood still for long minutes until my courage abandoned me. I locked the bedroom door, lay in bed, and stayed awake until dawn. But the worst was realizing something on the floor as I left the room that morning. Scratch marks, made from the inside out, exactly where the wall had been knocked. I should have left that morning, taken my things, locked the door, and never returned. But somehow, I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the wall was damaged before. Maybe I was too tired to think clearly. I ignored the instinct screaming inside me and went to work. When I returned that night, I noticed something different. A strange smell in the air, something metallic and sour, like iron mixed with sweat. I checked the kitchen, the bathroom, and even the service area, but found nothing out of place. I decided it was time to reinforce my security. I asked for an app to install a camera in the hallway and another in the living room. If something happened, I would have proof. That night, I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to a low, continuous sound. It was a kind of whisper coming from the living room. Lying in bed, I felt my blood freeze. I grabbed my cell phone to check the cameras. On the screen, the living room looked empty, but the sound was there, undeniable. It was as if someone were murmuring unintelligible words. My heart was beating like a drum when I got up, cell phone in one hand, knife in the other. I slowly opened the bedroom door. The living room was dark except for the bluish light of the camera's LED. I headed towards the sound, which stopped as soon as I entered the room. The silence was oppressive. That's when I noticed. The chair at the kitchen table was turned. I hadn't moved it. I ran back to the bedroom and locked the door again. I watched the camera footage in the morning, with daylight giving me courage. At 2:58 a.m., I clearly saw what happened. The chair simply slid back on its own and then tipped over. There was no one in the room, just the sudden movement, as if an invisible force had pushed it. On the fourth night, something even more terrifying happened. I was in the bedroom again, trying to ignore the occasional sounds in the hallway, when I heard my own voice. "Who's there?" The perfect recording of my question from 2 days ago. But it wasn't possible. There was no one who could have recorded it. I looked through the peephole at the hallway. It was empty, but something was wrong. The rug that stayed there, always centered, was crumpled, pushed to the side, as if someone had tripped over it. My instinct told me not to open the door, but the curiosity was unbearable. As soon as I opened it, something slipped inside. A cold draft, as if it had brought a piece of the night outside with it. And then I saw a crumpled piece of paper on the floor. I picked it up carefully, my hands shaking. The message was written in crooked, almost childish letters. "Are you hearing me now?" I didn't go back to sleep. I called the police that dawn, but they found nothing abnormal except the paper, which they took as evidence. The officer who handled my case gave me a tired look, as if he had dealt with many similar stories before. "Sometimes people think they hear things. It could be stress, he said. But I knew it wasn't just that. There was something there. Something that didn't just want to scare. It wanted to be noticed. And worse, it seemed to be enjoying the attention I was giving it. On the 5th day, I decided to leave. As I put my things in the car, I felt a pair of eyes watching me. I looked at the building and saw something that made me freeze. In the empty apartment next to mine, the curtain moved. Through a crack, I could swear I saw a shadow. But I didn't wait to confirm. I left the key on the owner's counter without explanation. I don't know who or what was in that apartment, but I know one thing: it didn't like being ignored. And ever since, every time I hear a sound in the silence of the night, I am afraid that, somehow, it has followed me. Because the deepest fear is not being alone. It's knowing that you never were. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After months of living in the city's hustle and bustle, I finally found a place that seemed to offer peace. A small apartment in an old building on a quiet street in the outskirts. It wasn't luxurious, but it had a rustic charm. Exposed brick walls, large windows that let in the late afternoon light, and a small balcony where I could see the deserted street. It was perfect. On the first night, as I unpacked boxes and assembled the furniture, I noticed something peculiar. The closet door in the hallway was ajar. I didn't pay much attention, thinking I might have left it that way. I closed the door and continued my work. However, when I passed by again, it was open again. I stood still for a moment, trying to remember if I had moved it without noticing. I decided to convince myself that it was the uneven floor, something that made the doors move easily. I was tired. Long days of moving could mess with your senses. On the second night, the feeling of comfort began to dissolve. I was sitting on the sofa, watching some show, when I heard a sound coming from the bedroom. It was low, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch my attention. A rhythmic talk, talk, talk. I paused the television and remained silent, trying to identify the source. It must be the building. Old buildings make strange noises, I thought, but the word sounded more like an attempt to convince myself than a real explanation. When I went to bed, the restlessness wouldn't leave me. Every time I closed my eyes, I seemed to hear something, light footsteps almost inaudible in the hallway. A dragging sound on the floor. I woke up a few times during the night, heart racing, but never found anything. On the third day, things got even stranger. It was late afternoon. The sun was setting, and I was in the kitchen preparing a quick dinner. That's when Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something in the living room window. A figure. Someone standing there, looking inside. I froze. I turned my face slowly, expecting to find some curious neighbor or someone outside, but there was no one. I went out on the balcony, looked in all directions. Nothing. The street was empty, as always. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, like an itch on the back of my neck. I went back inside and closed all the windows. I locked the front door and checked the peephole. Paranoia was starting to take over, but I was still trying to rationalize. Maybe it was just a reflection of something, a play of light and shadow. That night, something changed. It was no longer just sounds or figures. I woke up in the middle of the night with the unmistakable feeling that there was someone in the room. The air seemed dense, heavy, and the temperature was lower than it should have been. I lay still, trying not to make any sudden movements. My gaze was drawn to the corner of the room, where the darkness seemed denser. Something was there. Almost without breathing, I reached for the switch next to the bed and turned on the light. The room was empty, but the damn closet in the hallway was ajar again. I got up, my legs trembling, and went there. I opened the door all at once, expecting to find some animal, some logical reason for it. It was empty, but the smell was different. Something damp, like moldy wood, mixed with a slight metallic odor. I returned to the room and locked the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, my back against the wall, trying to push away the feeling that something was about to happen. Something I couldn't control. After that night, sleeping was no longer an option. I spent the following days in a state of constant alertness, trying to find some explanation for what was happening. I hired a locksmith to change the locks. I told him it was just a precaution, but I couldn't help watching his every move, as if he might be involved in something I didn't understand. That same night, I began to feel that the paranoia was overflowing. I closed all the curtains, locked the bedroom door, and still couldn't feel safe. Any noise seemed amplified, as if the walls of the house were conspiring to make me lose my mind. And then, while I was on the sofa trying to pretend I was reading a book, the sound came. Different from the previous ones. It was the unmistakable noise of something being dragged on the floor, slow, heavy. I froze for a moment, unable to react. Finally, I got up, forcing my body to move. I grabbed my cell phone, using the flashlight to illuminate the hallway. My breathing was so loud that it muffled the sounds around me. When I reached the end of the hallway, I realized that the noise was coming from the living room. The balcony door was open. I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. The wind made the curtain sway gently, but there was something wrong with the scene, something I couldn't identify immediately. Then I saw it. There were marks on the floor, as if something had been dragged inside. Scratches on the wood. They went to the center of the room and stopped. I turned on all the lights, trying to force normality back into the environment. I looked around, searching for something, anything that would explain those marks. Nothing. They just ended there, in the middle of nowhere. And then, the power went out. The snap was followed by a darkness so dense that it seemed to envelop me like a blanket. The cell phone flashlight was still on, but the circle of light seemed useless against the darkness around me. That's when I realized I was no longer alone. In the corner of the room, right where the marks on the floor ended, there was a shadow. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was something more, something solid, something that seemed to breathe. The cell phone light flickered as I slowly approached, each step costing more than the last. When the light finally reached the corner, my heart almost stopped. It was a face, not human, but something close to it. The eyes were large, black like bottomless pits, and they were fixed on me.
The mouth was small, with a slight smile that looked more like a cut. It didn't move, but I could feel that it was alive, that it was waiting for me. The flashlight went out, leaving me in absolute darkness. I don't know if I was going crazy, if I was seeing things, but it left me uneasy. I screamed, stumbling and running to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. I leaned against the wood, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a few seconds, everything was silent. Then the knocking started. No, I wasn't crazy. That seemed real. They weren't on the bedroom door, but on the walls. At first soft, then stronger, as if something wanted to crush me in that space. I spent the whole night like that, huddled in a corner, holding anything I could use as a weapon. When daylight finally came, everything stopped. I left the apartment that morning. I didn't take anything with me, just the keys and the cell phone. I didn't care about the furniture, the clothes, anything. I just needed to get out of there. Now, weeks later, I am in a new place, trying to rebuild my life. But every night, when the lights go out, I feel that presence. It doesn't matter where I am, it seems to have followed me. I decided to see a psychiatrist. It was the last attempt to convince myself that all this was just a mental breakdown, that my mind was playing tricks on me. He was a calm man, with a smile that seemed rehearsed, and he listened patiently as I poured out everything, from the noises in the apartment to the face in the darkness and the persistent feeling of being watched. He diagnosed me with extreme anxiety and possible hallucinations due to stress. He prescribed a combination of medications and suggested weekly therapy sessions. "You'll be fine," he said, with a confidence I couldn't share. I went home with the pills in hand, trying to cling to the idea that they could be my salvation. That night, I took the first dose and lay down, hoping sleep would come. But instead of rest, I was greeted by the same feeling of cold and presence that had haunted me since that day. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a familiar sound. The talk, talk, talk. This time, it wasn't coming from the wall or the hallway. It was coming from inside my bedroom. The snap was followed by a darkness so dense that it seemed to envelop me like a blanket. The cell phone flashlight was still on, but the circle of light seemed useless against the darkness around me. That's when I realized I was no longer alone. In the corner of the room, right where the marks on the floor ended, there was a shadow. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was something more, something solid, something that seemed to breathe. The cell phone light flickered as I slowly approached, each step costing more than the last. When the light finally reached the corner, my heart almost stopped. It was a face, not human, but something close to it. The eyes were large, black like bottomless pits, and they were fixed on me. The mouth was small, with a slight smile that looked more like a cut. It didn't move, but I could feel that it was alive, that it was waiting for me. The flashlight went out, leaving me in absolute darkness. I don't know if I was going crazy, if I was seeing things, but it left me uneasy. I screamed, stumbling and running to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. I leaned against the wood, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a few seconds, everything was silent. Then the knocking started. No, I wasn't crazy. That seemed real. They weren't on the bedroom door, but on the walls. At first soft, then stronger, as if something wanted to crush me in that space. I spent the whole night like that, huddled in a corner, holding anything I could use as a weapon. When daylight finally came, everything stopped. I left the apartment that morning. I didn't take anything with me, just the keys and the cell phone. I didn't care about the furniture, the clothes, anything. I just needed to get out of there. Now, weeks later, I am in a new place, trying to rebuild my life. But every night, when the lights go out, I feel that presence. It doesn't matter where I am, it seems to have followed me. I decided to see a psychiatrist. It was the last attempt to convince myself that all this was just a mental breakdown, that my mind was playing tricks on me. He was a calm man, with a smile that seemed rehearsed, and he listened patiently as I poured out everything, from the noises in the apartment to the face in the darkness and the persistent feeling of being watched. He diagnosed me with extreme anxiety and possible hallucinations due to stress. He prescribed a combination of medications and suggested weekly therapy sessions. "You'll be fine," he said, with a confidence I couldn't share. I went home with the pills in hand, trying to cling to the idea that they could be my salvation. That night, I took the first dose and lay down, hoping sleep would come. But instead of rest, I was greeted by the same feeling of cold and presence that had haunted me since that day. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a familiar sound. The tock, tock, tock. This time, it wasn't coming from the wall or the hallway. It was coming from inside my bedroom.
When I moved into this apartment, it seemed perfect, small but cozy, on the 4th floor of an old building with large windows that let in the morning light. It was my first completely owned space after the divorce. The rent was below average, something rare in such a bustling city. The caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Gregorio, handed me the keys with a kind smile and casually mentioned, "Oh, don't worry about the noises at night. The walls here are thin." I found it funny at the time. Of course, old buildings have their creaks and groans. I thought he was just warning me about the neighbors. The first night was quiet. I unpacked, put on my favorite vinyl record, and had a glass of wine on the sofa. It felt good to be alone, not having to explain my movements or thoughts to anyone. When the music stopped, silence filled the space. I went to bed early, lulled by the serenity of my new refuge. But on the second night, while I was washing the dinner dishes, I heard a sound that made me stop. A click, a faint but distinct noise coming from the front door. It was like the sound of a key turning in the lock. I turned off the faucet and stood still, listening. The silence returned, but my skin tingled. I walked to the door slowly, feeling ridiculous for being so apprehensive. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, lit only by the fluorescent light from the ceiling. I took a deep breath, locked the door again, and went back to the kitchen. On the third night, I was awakened by a sound coming from the living room, something like a long, drawn-out creak, as if a chair had been moved. My heart raced. There was no way to ignore it. I turned on the bedside lamp, grabbed my phone, and went to check. The room was as I had left it, with the armchair by the window, the books organized in the corner, and my bag on the sofa. But something seemed out of place, not obviously, but as if the energy had changed. An unfamiliar scent lingered in the air, something metallic, like blood or iron. I tried to convince myself that it was my imagination, that I was being paranoid. I locked the living room door and went back to bed, but I stayed awake for hours, listening to every creak and groan of the building. The next morning, I mentioned the sounds to Mr. Gregorio as I left for work. He gave an enigmatic smile and said, "You'll get used to it. Everyone does." That made me uncomfortable, but I didn't want to press. Maybe he was just trying to be reassuring. But that night, I discovered something I couldn't ignore. When I got home, there was a deep scratch on the door, near the lock. It didn't look like an accidental scratch. It was as if someone had passed something sharp there, testing the wood. And that wasn't all. On my kitchen table, next to the mug I had left in the morning, there was a key. It wasn't my key. It was old, rusty, with the number 17 engraved on the metal. The number made no sense. I lived in apartment 401. There was no apartment 17 in the building. I decided to ask Mr. Gregorio about the key the next day. But that night, the noises started again. And this time, they weren't just creaks or groans. They were footsteps. Slow, precise, above me.
The problem? I was the only resident on the top floor. That night was the longest of my life. The footsteps didn't stop. First, they came from above, as if someone was walking on a non-existent floor. Then, they seemed to descend the walls, as if the sound was spreading through the building. I sat on the sofa, hugging my knees, with all the lights on. I grabbed my phone and searched for videos or forums about the building. I didn't find anything useful. No stories, no mention of the number 17. The key was still on the table, like a reminder that something didn't make sense. Around 3 a.m., the noise ceased, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath. That's when I heard it. Click. The sound of my door unlocking. My body froze. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and positioned myself against the wall, with the phone in the other hand, ready to call the police. But the door didn't open. I heard footsteps in the hallway, coming and going, getting closer and closer to my door, as if someone was walking in circles. I decided to look through the peephole. My heart almost stopped. There was no one in the hallway. But something was wrong. The fluorescent light seemed dimmer, as if it was flickering, and the sound of footsteps continued, despite me not seeing anyone. I went back inside and pushed a piece of furniture against the door. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I went straight to Mr. Gregorio's apartment. He seemed surprised to see me so early, but his usual smile vanished when I showed him the key. This key was inside my apartment. Number 17? What does this mean? And the noises at night? Someone is walking around the building. This can't be normal. He was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. Finally, he sighed. You should have asked before signing the contract. There are things in this building, old things, things even I can't explain. What do you mean? I insisted. Is this some kind of sick joke? Do you know what's going on here? He hesitated, but finally murmured. Apartment 17 should never have existed. A long time ago, there was a room on the top floor where the original caretakers of the building lived. They say they made problematic tenants disappear. When the police came to investigate, they found only the key and blood on the walls. Since then, no one has been able to explain the sounds or the disappearances. Disappearances? My stomach churned. You are strong, he continued, as if trying to console me. You've made it this far. Just don't let him find you. Him who? I asked, but he just closed the door. I spent the day wondering if I should move, but something in me resisted. I didn't want to be another person haunted by this place. That night, the key disappeared, and with it, my sense of security. When I went to bed, the silence was so heavy that I could hear my own breathing. I locked the door and pushed more furniture against it, but something in the environment seemed different. The air was colder, and my body shivered for no apparent reason. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a subtle sound, a whisper. Not words, but something low and drawn out, like someone's breath. I looked around the room, my heart beating so hard I thought.
That's when I saw it. The armchair by the window was no longer empty. A blurry figure, more shadow than body, was sitting there. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It just watched. I blinked, and it disappeared. But the scratch on the living room door reappeared the next morning, this time much deeper, as if something or someone was trying to get in. Since then, the nights have never been the same. No matter what I do, the footsteps continue, and the feeling that someone is watching me never goes away. I decided to move, but I am not sure if it will be enough. Sometimes I feel like I've taken something with me. The metallic smell still comes back, unexplained, and I've woken up twice with a new key on my table. I still keep the first key. I don't know why. Maybe because, deep down, I know this will never end. Not for me, not for anyone who entered apartment 401. My name is Julia. I am 29 years old, and until yesterday, I believed that living alone was the greatest symbol of my independence. My new apartment, a small and cozy room at the end of a suburban street, was my refuge. With simple furniture and a view of the empty field behind the building, it seemed perfect. Everything was going well until last night. Now, I can't stop shaking. It was a Tuesday, and as usual, I got home late after a long day at the office. The street was deserted, lit only by a row of lampposts that cast restless shadows on the asphalt. The air was cold, with that metallic smell that always reminded me of storms. I carried my bag on one shoulder and grocery bags on the other. A man passed by on a bicycle, his head down and his face partially hidden by a hood. Even though he didn't stare at me, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I closed the apartment door with a sigh of relief, the sound of the latch echoing through the empty space. As always, the first thing I did was check if all the windows were locked. It was almost a ritual, something that made me feel safe. Then, I left the bags in the kitchen and went to take a shower. It was when I came out of the bathroom that something bothered me. The hallway seemed darker than usual. Even with the light on, there was an unusual shadow cast in the corner of the living room. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just fatigue. I made some tea and sat on the sofa, the sound of the wind outside breaking the silence of the night. Around 11, I started hearing strange noises. At first, they were muffled footsteps, as if someone was in the hallway of the building. It wasn't unusual to hear the neighbors, but this time it seemed different. The footsteps came and went, stopping exactly in front of my door. I got up and looked through the peephole, but I didn't see anyone. I went back to the sofa, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. I turned on the television to drown out the silence. The discomfort remained. Shortly afterward, I heard something even more disturbing. The sound of something scraping against my door, as if someone was scratching the wood. My heart raced. I went to the door again, but this time, instead of looking through the peephole, I stood still, trying to listen. There was nothing else, no sound, not even the footsteps. That's when I realized the chain that I always put on the door wasn't there. My mind started racing, trying to remember if I had really forgotten or if someone had come in while I was distracted. I grabbed my phone and moved closer to the window to look outside. The street was empty except for a flickering lamppost that cast dancing shadows on the ground. Suddenly, I heard a sound coming from inside the apartment. Something had fallen in the bedroom. Frozen in place, I held the phone so tightly that my fingers went numb. The sound in the bedroom echoed in my mind like a muffled scream. My breathing became shallow, and I had to force myself to take a deep breath to keep from fainting right there. Maybe it was just the wind, I whispered, as if hearing my own voice was enough to dispel the fear. But how could the wind be inside my apartment? Each step toward the bedroom seemed like an eternity. The hallway seemed longer, and the sound of my breathing filled the silence like a drum at a funeral. The door was ajar, and the light from the bedside lamp, which I had left on, cast tortuous shadows on the walls. "Is someone there?" My voice came out shaky, almost inaudible. No answer. I pushed the door open slowly, each inch seeming like a monumental effort. The room was empty, but my dresser, which was in the corner, had something out of place. One of the drawers was open. I knew I hadn't left it that way. My hands trembled as I approached. Inside the drawer, my necklaces were tangled, as if someone had pulled them in a hurry. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear it in my ears. A small piece of paper was crumpled among the necklaces. I picked it up, trying to decipher what it was. "Did you really lock all the windows?" I took a step back, almost tripping over the rug. It was impossible. Someone had been there. Was someone still there? I looked around, every corner of the room seeming to harbor something invisible, lurking. I grabbed my phone, dialing the police number, but stopped before calling. Something at the window caught my attention. The curtain was slightly open. I knew I had closed it before taking a shower. When I approached, I noticed something even more terrifying. There were handprints on the inside of the glass, as if someone had pressed their fingers there, watching, maybe watching me. At that moment, the most horrifying sound of the night began. It was like a low, constant whisper coming from the living room. The voice was distorted, as if someone was trying to form words but couldn't. "Julia." My body froze. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the sound continued, insistent, calling my name in a grotesque and drawn-out way. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, each movement calculated, even with my legs shaking uncontrollably. I walked to the living room, trying to convince myself that this was a figment of my imagination. But the voice grew louder, clearer. "Julia, you are not alone." When I entered the living room, I saw the television turned off, reflecting the image of the room. Behind me, a silhouette. I spun around, raising the knife, but there was no one there. The room seemed to have changed, as if the shadows had a life of their own. The front door was unlocked. I ran to lock it again, my hands barely able to hold the latch. When I turned to look around, there was something different in the air, a metallic smell, blood. The sound of something dragging behind me made my heart almost stop. I looked back slowly. In the darkest corner of the living room, where the shadows seemed to gather, something moved. A hunched figure, its eyes glowing like two embers. "You should have run," the thing whispered. And then, in an impossible movement, it lunged at me. I woke up hours later, lying on the living room floor. The knife was still in my hand, but the apartment was empty. Everything was as before, except for the door, which was open. Since that night, I've never been able to sleep alone again. Sometimes when I turn off the lights, I still hear that voice, whispering my name in the dark. If you enjoyed these horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share with your friends. Thank you so much for being here, and see you next time, where the fear never sleeps.